The sun had already dipped low, its orange glow bleeding across the horizon and setting the prairie sky aflame. Dust rose from the road in faint clouds, clinging to the hem of the young woman's dress as she walked alone. Her shoes, once sturdy, enough for city cobblestones, were now frayed and thin from miles of gravel and dirt. She carried only a small satchel pressed close against her side, as if it contained her entire life. And in truth, it nearly did. She was young, perhaps not yet 20, and though her features were delicate, they bore the marks of hardship. Her cheeks, pale and hollow from too many days without a full meal, gave her eyes a wide and haunted look. Yet even beneath her weariness, there was something unspoiled in her face, an innocence that had not yet been broken, though it trembled on. The edge of fear, every sound made her heart quicken. The distant caw of a crow, the creak of a wagon wheel far down the trail, even the rustle of grass when the wind swept through, it all seemed louder to her ears. She pulled her shawl tighter, though the evening was still warm. It wasn't the cold she feared, but the watchful eyes of strangers and the cruelty of those who might see her alone and defenseless. The town she approached was small, little more than a handful of buildings gathered along the dirt road, their wooden signs swaying gently on iron hooks. The saloon's windows were already glowing, laughter and music spilling out, while the mercantile was locking its doors for the night. A blacksmith hammered away, his glowing forge painting his face with fire. For someone else, the sight of community might have been comforting. For her, it was daunting. She slowed her pace as she neared the edge of town, unsure if she should enter at all. The last town she had passed through had not been kind. Whispers had followed her, sharp as knives. What's she doing here alone? Where's her family? Don't trust a girl who won't say where she comes from. She had fled before anyone pressed too hard, afraid of being exposed for what she was, a runaway, a girl with no one to speak for her and no place to call home. Her stomach knotted at the thought of stepping into another town full of eyes and questions. Yet she had no choice. Night was coming, and the open prairie was no place for a girl to sleep alone. She forced herself onward, her gaze fixed on the ground to avoid the stares she imagined waiting for her. A wagon rattled past, its driver glancing her way before clicking his tongue to hurry his horses along. Two women, arms linked as they crossed. The street paused long enough to give her a curious look, then whispered something she couldn't hear. She lowered her head further, wishing she could disappear. At last, she paused outside the general store, where a bench stood empty. Her feet ached, her body weary from the long day's march, and she sank down with a quiet sigh. She pressed her satchel to her lap like a shield, eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. She told herself she would rest for only a moment, then move on. Perhaps she would find a barn where she might ask to sleep in the hay, or a church where the preacher might take pity on her. But beneath her practical thoughts lay a deeper ache, the longing for kindness. She had been running so long, guarded, so tightly that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like for someone to look at her with gentleness instead of suspicion. Her heart whispered for safety, for a place where she could be seen not as a burden or a stranger, but as someone worth sheltering. The evening deepened, the glow of lamps spilling into the street, and she shivered despite the warmth. She did not know that somewhere in this small town, fate had already begun to turn. A man with a steady gaze and a quiet strength would soon notice her, not as the townsfolk did, but with the kind of eyes that saw beyond fear. And a child, lonely and bright, would reach out a hand that would change the course of her life. But for now, she sat alone on the bench, clutching her satchel and whispering to herself the same words she had repeated since her journey began. Just one more day. Just hold on one more day. The last of the daylight was fading when she lifted her head from the bench. Her body was heavy with fatigue, but her mind refused to rest. Each shadow creeping across the dusty street seemed to carry a threat, and every burst of laughter spilling from the saloon made her shoulders tense. She was about to rise and force herself to keep walking when the sound of spurred boots drew her attention. He came from the opposite side of the street, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the light breeze. His stride was unhurried, steady, like a man who had no need to prove himself. His coat was worn, the leather of his boots scuffed, but there was a quiet pride in the way he carried himself. A man shaped by work, by responsibility, by the land. She stiffened, fingers clutching the satchel in her lap as if it were a shield. She had learned to be wary of men. Too many had offered smiles that carried sharp edges, or questions that were too pointed, too prying. This one had not even spoken. But the mere fact of his presence made her heart drum fast. She dropped her gaze to the dirt, willing him to walk past. But he didn't. Instead, he slowed, noticing the solitary figure of a young woman on the bench. Something in her posture, the way she shrank into herself, tugged at him. He was not a man given to meddling in other people's business, but neither could he walk by someone who looked so clearly lost. He stopped a respectful distance away and tipped his hat. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice low and even, carrying no hint of threat. Her throat tightened. She forced a small nod. Her voice caught somewhere between fear and politeness. "Good evening, sir." Up close, he could see the strain in her face, the fatigue etched in her eyes. She looked too young to be wandering alone, too fragile to be hardened like the frontier demanded. He frowned slightly, but not in judgment, more in concern. "You headed somewhere?" he asked after a moment. Her lips parted, then pressed closed. Again. She could not tell him the truth, that she had no place waiting, no destination, except away from the past that haunted her. So she only shook her head, whispering, "Just passing through." He studied her quietly. He had been around long enough to know when someone was hiding more than they said, but he also knew the weight of silence, how sometimes pressing too hard only deepened fear. So he let it be. "Well," he said, shifting slightly, "night's coming on. Not the safest thing for a young lady to be out here on her own." The words, though kindly meant, made her stiffen. She drew the satchel closer, her chin lifting slightly, ready to defend herself if his concern turned into something else. He noticed the gesture, and a corner of his mouth softened. Not quite a smile, but a reassurance. "Don't mean you harm," he added gently. "Name's Daniel Hayes. I've a ranch a few miles out. Just came in for supplies." She blinked, surprised by the simplicity of his introduction. Most men offered questions before names, demands before assurances. This one had offered his name first, as though to show her he was no shadow, no stranger to be feared. Still, uncertainty clung to her. "Thank you," she murmured, "but I'll be all right." Daniel hesitated, then nodded once, accepting her words. He knew when to step back. Yet something in him resisted the thought of leaving her there, alone, vulnerable, with nowhere safe to go. He adjusted the sack of goods slung over his shoulder and, instead of pressing further, offered a small kindness. "There's a diner 2 doors down. Martha runs it. Good food, fair price. She won't ask questions if you're needing a meal." Her eyes lifted at last, cautious but curious. His tone was steady, without pity, without insistence. Just kind. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time that evening, her voice carried something other than fear. Daniel tipped his hat again. "Take care now." And with that, he started down the road, his boots striking the dirt with steady rhythm. She watched him go, conflicted. Part of her was relieved that he hadn't pressed further, hadn't demanded answers she wasn't ready to give. Another part, smaller but insistent, felt the stir of something unfamiliar. Trust. A stranger had looked at her and seen not a burden, or a scandal, but simply a person in need. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. That same man would cross her path again, and when he did, he would not be alone. With him would come a child's bright eyes, full of questions and warmth, and in that child's gaze she would find something she had been searching for all along: belonging. For now, though, she sat still on the bench, the echo of his voice, lingering in her ears. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she allowed herself a breath that wasn't heavy with fear. The following morning dawned bright, with the prairie sun climbing quickly into a wide blue sky. The town was already stirring when Daniel Hayes stepped down from his wagon, his young daughter perched on the seat behind him. Clara was 7, a lively girl with tangled brown curls that refused to stay tied with ribbons. Her eyes, so like her late mother's, were wide and curious, always darting here and there as if the world was too full to take in at once. She had inherited her father's quiet strength, but not his reserved manner. Where Daniel was cautious with words, Clara was bold with them, spilling questions before most grown folk had time to answer the first. She swung her legs from the wagon seat impatiently while her father tied the reins. "Papa, can I come with you? Please? I promise I'll stay close." Daniel gave her a look that was both stern and indulgent. "You can come, but no wandering. You mind me, Clara? I always mind," she said quickly, though both knew that wasn't entirely true. They entered the main street together, Clara skipping at her father's side. She loved these trips into town. The noise, the bustle, the chance to peer at new fabrics in the mercantile or catch the smell of fresh bread at the diner. To her, town was a place of endless possibility, though she always kept half an eye on her father, knowing he disliked being away from the ranch longer than necessary. As they passed the bench near the general store, Clara's eyes landed on the young woman sitting there. She was still clutching her satchel, her posture guarded, but the way her face lifted to watch the street struck Clara immediately. There was a softness there, tinged with sadness, that made Clara's small heart ache. "Papa," Clara whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Who's that?" Daniel glanced briefly, his expression unreadable. "Just someone passing through. But she looks lonely." He gave no reply, only guided Clara toward the mercantile, but she kept sneaking glances over her shoulder. Most grown-ups, Clara knew, walked right past people without seeing them. But children noticed things, like how the stranger's shoes were worn thin, or how she tried to smile politely at others, but never truly met their eyes. Inside the store, while Daniel bartered over flour and nails, Clara pressed her nose to the window. The young woman still sat outside, shoulders drawn tight as though holding herself together against a strong wind. Clara felt something stir in her chest, something she couldn't name, but which felt very much like the pull of friendship. When her father finished, Clara was waiting at the door. "Papa," she said, "couldn't we ask her if she needs help?" Daniel paused, studying his daughter's earnest face. He had always admired her compassion, though it worried him too. The world was not kind, and he had sworn to protect her from its cruelties. Still, he remembered the way the girl on the bench had clutched her satchel, the wariness in her eyes. Clara wasn't wrong. She did look lonely. "We'll see," he said at last, steering Clara toward the wagon. But Clara was not one to let things rest. Once seated again, she twisted around to peer back at the stranger, who now seemed even smaller, against the bustle of town. Clara's heart ached. She had lost her mother 2 winters ago, and though her father's love filled most of the empty space, there was still a hollow she could not name. Sometimes she wished for someone else, someone gentle, who might brush her hair or tell her stories at night. When she looked at the young woman on the bench, some part of Clara felt as though that wish might not be so far-fetched. The wagon jolted forward, but Clara leaned close to her father. "Papa, she doesn't have anybody. I can tell. We should help her." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. He kept his gaze on the road ahead, but his jaw worked as though he were wrestling with a thought. Finally, he sighed. It's not always so simple, Clara. Folks carry their own stories. Sometimes they don't want help. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe she just needs someone to ask." Daniel glanced at his daughter, at the innocence and conviction in her small face. He thought of the stranger's hollow cheeks, her frightened eyes, the way she had thanked him the night before as if no one had spoken kindly to her in a long time. Clara might be right. Maybe what the girl needed wasn't answers or pity, just a hand offered freely, without strings. As the wagon rolled past the edge of town, Clara looked back once more. The girl on the bench was still there, clutching her satchel as if it were her only anchor. Clara made a silent promise in her heart. The next time they came into town, she would talk to her, and as fate would have it, she wouldn't have to wait long. By the time the prairie sun dipped below the horizon, the little town was folding into evening. Lamps glowed in windows, the scent of stew drifted from the diner, and wagons rattled toward homesteads before the dark could swallow the road. The young woman, still perched on that same bench, felt the weight of the hour pressing in. Night was not her friend. She knew too well how danger prowled when shadows stretched long, and the thought of sleeping in the open made her stomach clench with dread. She rose, clutching her satchel, and walked slowly down the street as if the motion alone might summon courage. Her eyes darted toward alleys, barns, and porches, calculating where she might ask for a corner of shelter or where she could hide unseen. But each option carried risk. Strangers' doors often opened with suspicion. Barns might mean anger from the owner, or worse. Her steps faltered outside the diner. Through the glass, she saw warmth, Martha ladling stew into bowls. Tired men, huddled over coffee, and families breaking bread together. It looked so safe, so ordinary, so unreachable. She pressed a hand to her satchel and whispered to herself, "Just a meal. Maybe they won't notice me." Before she could push open, "The door!" a familiar voice came from behind. "Evening, miss." She turned quickly, startled, but relief flickered in her chest when she saw the man from earlier, Daniel Hayes. He carried a sack of supplies in one hand, his hat tipped back, and his daughter trotting beside him with eager steps. Clara spotted her immediately. "Papa! It's her!" she whispered loudly, tugging at his sleeve. The young woman flushed under the child's gaze, suddenly aware of her travel-worn dress, her tangled hair, and the thinness of her frame. She lowered her eyes, ready to excuse herself and slip away, but Clara had already bounded forward, stopping a few feet away, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Are you all alone?" The question, simple and earnest, cut deeper than any whisper she had endured in the past weeks. She swallowed hard, her lips parting, but no words coming. Her gaze flickered toward Daniel, expecting him to scold his daughter for prying. Instead, Daniel's voice was calm. "Clara," he said gently, "mind your manners." Then, turning to the stranger, he added, "She means no harm, just curious." The girl nodded, unashamed. "You look tired. Papa, couldn't she come with us?" The young woman's breath caught. Her instinct was to protest, to shake her head quickly, to insist she needed nothing. But her body betrayed her with a faint sway of exhaustion, and Daniel noticed. He studied her for a long moment. He had seen this before. People worn thin by travel, pride barely holding them upright. He knew the danger of leaving someone vulnerable, in the dark, and he also knew that sometimes kindness was the only thing that stood between a person and despair. "You've no place to stay tonight?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. A dozen excuses formed on her tongue, but they felt brittle, false. At last she whispered, "No." Daniel nodded once as though the answer had been expected. Our ranch isn't far. We've a spare room. You'd be welcome for the night." The words were spoken simply, without flourish, without pity. Still, they stunned her. She shook her head quickly. "I couldn't impose—" "It's no imposition," he interrupted firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "Safer than being." "Out here!" Clara clapped her hands, delighted. "See, Papa said so. You can come with us." The young woman's eyes burned. No one had invited her in such a way before. Not as a burden, but as though she were wanted. The offer felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. Still, fear lingered. What if they discovered her past? What if she stayed too long? And it all unraveled? Daniel seemed to read her hesitation. "Just one night," he said. "Nothing more expected." Her throat tightened, but she nodded slowly. "Thank you." They shared the wagon ride under a sky thick with stars. Clara chattered. The whole way. About the horses, about the ranch, about the wildflowers she had picked that morning. The young woman listened, her lips curving into the faintest smile despite her weariness. The child's warmth seeped into her bones like a forgotten comfort. When they reached the ranch house, a modest wooden structure framed by the endless prairie, Daniel carried the supplies inside, while Clara tugged eagerly at the woman's hand. "Come on, I'll show you where you can sleep. It's real cozy." The spare room was simple, with a narrow bed, a quilt patched by loving hands, and a window that looked out over the fields. To the woman, it might as well have been a palace. She set her satchel down carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid this kindness would vanish if she touched it too roughly. Clara beamed at her. "Good night. You'll feel better in the morning, I promise." Then she darted away, leaving the woman alone in the quiet room. She sat on the bed, trembling. For the first time in months, she was inside four walls that did not belong to strangers who sneered or to memories she feared. She pulled the quilt over her lap, breathing in the faint scent of lavender stitched into the fabric, and for the first time, morning sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a soft glow over the quilt that covered her. For a moment, before memory returned, she simply lay there, cocooned in warmth, her body sinking into the mattress as if it had been waiting for years to rest. The scent of coffee drifted faintly through the air, mingled with wood smoke from the kitchen stove. But peace was a fragile thing. As she sat up and pressed her bare feet to the wooden floor, the weight of her past pressed in, with it. Every step she had taken to reach this place had been guided by fear, fear of being found, fear of being judged, fear of being cast aside. She had accepted Daniel Hayes's offer of shelter because exhaustion had left her no other choice, but now that she had woken beneath his roof, panic stirred in her chest. What if they asked questions? What if he demanded to know where she came from, why she had been alone, why she carried nothing but a satchel with too few belongings? She had no answers she could give without unraveling the fragile shield of silence she'd wrapped around herself. Her fingers tightened on the satchel as she pulled it close, checking its contents. A worn dress, a folded scrap of paper with a name she no longer dared to speak, and a small locket that was the only thing she had managed to keep from her childhood. Worthless to anyone else, but to her, it was both burden and lifeline. If anyone asked about it, about her family, about the place she had fled, what would she say? She lingered in the doorway of the spare room, listening to the sounds of life in the house. Daniel's voice was low, steady, as he spoke to Clara about chores for the day. Clara's lighter tones answered with the sing-song rhythm of a child, eager to please but easily distracted. The sounds were so ordinary, so domestic, that for a moment the woman felt like an intruder, peering into a life that wasn't hers. When she finally stepped into the kitchen, Clara beamed at her as though they had been friends forever. "Good morning. Papa made biscuits. Do you like biscuits?" The young woman nodded mutely, unsure if her voice would hold steady. She sat at the table, her eyes lowered, while Daniel slid a plate toward her. He said nothing of her silence, nothing of the tension in her posture. He only poured her coffee, then returned to his own seat, as though her presence required no explanation. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She had grown used to suspicion, to questions and whispers. His lack of demand left her unmoored, unsure whether to trust it. She ate quietly, the food both comforting and strange after so many days of scraps. Clara chattered all the while, about the horses, about school, about the stray cat that had taken to prowling near the barn. Yet beneath Clara's words, the woman felt Daniel's steady presence. He didn't pry, but his eyes occasionally flickered. Her way, thoughtful and assessing. Not harsh, not judging, just watchful, as though he recognized the storm she carried and knew better than to step into it too soon. After breakfast, Clara tugged eagerly at her hand. "Come see the ranch. Papa says I have to feed the hens, but I can show you the creek, too." The woman hesitated, glancing at Daniel, but he only gave a small nod. "She won't bite," he said softly, almost with a smile. So she followed Clara. Outside, the child's laughter guiding her across the yard. The sun was warm, the fields wide and golden, and for a little while she forgot to guard herself. Clara's enthusiasm was infectious. Her trust offered so freely that it felt like a balm on old wounds. But when they reached the creek and Clara dashed ahead to skip stones, the woman lingered on the bank, clutching her satchel once more. She knew this couldn't last. No kindness came without questions, and no haven lasted when the truth surfaced. She had run far, but not far enough. The past had a way of catching up, and if Daniel Hayes or the townsfolk ever discovered the truth, this fragile refuge would vanish like morning mist. The thought hollowed her. She wanted to believe in the warmth of this house, in the safety of Daniel's steady voice and Clara's open heart. But the voice of fear whispered louder, "Don't trust it. Don't stay. They'll turn you out like all the rest." That night, when the house fell quiet, she sat by the small window of her room and stared at the stars. The locket lay open in her palm, reflecting faint silver light. She traced its edges with trembling fingers, whispering the name she hadn't spoken aloud in months. Her secret was still hers to carry, but already under this roof, it felt heavier than ever. Life on the Hayes Ranch unfolded with a rhythm the young woman had never known before. Each day seemed stitched together by simple tasks, steady work, and the hum of nature around them. The whicker of horses in the barn, the cluck of hens in the yard, the soft rush of wind across the open prairie. To Daniel and Clara, it was ordinary life. To her, it was both strange and comforting, a pattern she slowly learned to step into. At first, she moved cautiously, as though afraid every motion might break the fragile hospitality she had been offered. On that first full morning, she tried to insist she would only stay long enough to regain her strength. But Clara had tugged her hand insistently toward the chicken coop, chattering about eggs and feathers, and Daniel had simply said, "No one's rushing you. Do as you're able." So she began to help. It was awkward at first, her city-raised hands unfamiliar with chores that required a firm, practical touch. She fumbled with the feed buckets, scattered grain unevenly, and earned a peck or two from a disgruntled hen. Clara laughed so hard she nearly dropped the basket, but her laughter wasn't cruel. It was the kind that invited the woman to laugh at herself, too. And slowly, she did. Inside the house, she found her footing more quickly. Cooking was one skill she had learned well, though mostly out of necessity in her past. When she prepared a simple meal of stew and biscuits one evening, Clara declared it the best supper ever, and even Daniel, who rarely offered more than a nod of approval, had murmured, "That's fine work," before asking for seconds. Something in her heart loosened then, just a little, as if belonging could be built one shared meal at a time. Days slipped into a quiet rhythm. Mornings were spent with chores, gathering eggs, sweeping floors, helping Clara with her lessons. Afternoons stretched wide, the heat shimmering over the fields while Daniel worked with the cattle or repaired fences. Sometimes she would carry water out to him, and he would tip his hat in thanks, his eyes meeting hers with a steadiness that unsettled her as much as it steadied her. There was no demand in his gaze, no suspicion, only a calm regard that seemed to say he saw her, even in her silence. Clara became her shadow, trailing her through the house and yard with endless questions. "Where did you learn to cook so well? Do you like stories? Will you braid my hair?" The girl's trust came so easily, so naturally, that it tugged at something deep inside the woman's heart. She found herself smiling more, laughing even, as she read aloud from Clara's small stack of books, or helped her practice writing letters at the kitchen table. But with each smile, with each moment of warmth, the young woman felt the sharp tug of fear. She knew she was weaving herself into their lives, even if she told herself it was only temporary. And she knew what happened when people discovered the truth about her, that she wasn't who she pretended to be, that she carried a past, too, heavy for others to bear. Still, the days continued, and with them came a slow shift inside her. The prairie had a way of softening edges, of silencing the constant hum of fear, if only for a while. At night, when she lay beneath the patchwork quilt in the spare room, she found herself listening not for danger, but for the familiar creak of the house settling, for the low murmur of Daniel moving about before bed, for Clara's faint giggle, drifting from her room as she whispered to her dolls. Once, in a rare unguarded moment, she caught herself humming while hanging laundry to dry in the sun. Clara had skipped past and stopped short, eyes wide. "You sound like Mama used to," the little girl said, so matter-of-fact that it stole the woman's breath. She froze, the clothespin trembling in her hand, torn between sorrow and an aching, impossible longing. Daniel, passing by with a coil of rope in his arms, had paused at Clara's words. His eyes flickered briefly to the young woman, but he said nothing, just kept walking. That quiet acceptance, his refusal to draw attention to the moment, felt like another kind of kindness. The woman told herself over and over that this was only temporary, that she would leave before anyone asked too much, before she grew too attached. But each day made it harder to imagine walking away. Each time Clara slipped her small hand into hers. Each time Daniel offered a nod of approval, or simply made space for her at the table, the idea of leaving felt less like safety and more like tearing out a piece of herself. And yet, the shadow of her secrets loomed. Even in moments of peace, she felt it, like storm clouds gathering on a far horizon. She knew it would come, sooner or later. But for now, in the warmth of the Hayes Ranch, she allowed herself something she had not dared in a long time. For now, she allowed herself to belong. It was inevitable. In a place as small as Dry Creek, nothing stayed secret for long. Folks noticed everything. Who bought extra flour, who missed Sunday service, whose fence posts were leaning, whose cattle strayed too near another's land. And they most certainly noticed when a stranger arrived and then lingered. The young woman had been at the Hayes Ranch for nearly a fortnight when the murmurs began. It started subtly. An extra glance when she walked into the mercantile with Clara. A pause in conversation when she passed two women on the boardwalk. She felt it in her bones, the way she had always felt the prickling edge of suspicion. "Who is she?" whispered Mrs. Whitcomb behind the counter of the mercantile. "She ain't kin to Daniel, that's certain. No ring on her finger," another woman said, pursing her lips. "And staying under his roof, folk will talk. They already were." Daniel, steady as ever, paid no mind. When he came to town for supplies, he spoke as he always had. Few words. clear and respectful. If someone asked outright about the woman, he simply said, "She's helping on the ranch. That's all." And he left it at that. But the young woman was not deaf to the whispers. Every time she stepped into town, her skin prickled with the weight of watching eyes. Clara's hand in hers was both comfort and torment. Comfort because the girl's trust was unshakable. Torment because she feared what damage gossip could do to the child's reputation. At the diner one evening, Martha set down a plate of stew in front of her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You settling in fine out at Hayes's place?" she asked, her tone casual, but her gaze sharp. The young woman fumbled with her spoon. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone's been kind." Martha nodded slowly, but the look she gave Daniel when she passed him his plate carried unspoken questions. Daniel met it evenly, saying nothing, but the woman could feel the air tighten around them. Later that night, back at the ranch, she sat by the window in her room, staring out at the dark fields. Clara was asleep, her laughter still echoing faintly in the halls, and Daniel was in the barn tending to a lame horse. Alone with her thoughts, the woman pressed her locket between her palms and felt the sting of fear return. It was happening again, the same cycle she had known before. Wherever she went, she was an outsider. People demanded answers she couldn't give, judged her for silence she couldn't break. She had thought, foolishly, that maybe this place would be different. But the prairie, wide as it was, couldn't keep whispers from curling around her like smoke. The next morning, as she walked through town with Clara, two boys pointed at her from the boardwalk, snickering. Clara noticed at once. Her small chin jutted forward, and she marched up to them with all the fierceness of her 7 years. "What are you laughing at?" she demanded. The boys mumbled something about the stranger at Hayes's before scurrying off, their bravado evaporating under Clara's glare. The young woman felt her heart twist at the child's defense, equal parts pride and sorrow. No child should have to carry another's burden. That evening, while they shelled peas on the porch, she tried to speak to Daniel. Maybe I should leave," she said quietly, her fingers trembling over the green pods. Daniel didn't look up from his work. "Because of town talk?" She swallowed hard. "I don't want Clara hurt by it. Or you." He was silent for a long moment, then set down his knife. His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Folks will talk no matter what. That's their way. But what happens under my roof is my business. And Clara's, not theirs." His words, simple and sure, sent warmth flooding through her chest. Yet, still fear lingered. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that kindness could outlast suspicion. But her past, her secret, still hung over her like a storm cloud. If the townsfolk ever learned the truth, she feared even Daniel's quiet strength wouldn't be enough to shield them. The whispers grew louder in the weeks that followed. Some said she was a runaway. Others speculated she had been left at the bay, altar or worse, cast out of her family for sins too shameful to name. Each rumor was sharper than the last, cutting into the fragile peace she had begun to build. And yet, every time doubt threatened to drive her away, Clara's small hand found hers, or Daniel's quiet voice grounded her. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing the whispers alone, but she knew it couldn't last forever. Whispers had a way of drawing shadows from the past, and hers was coming closer with each passing day. The storm she had feared was closer than she realized. It arrived not with thunder or lightning, but with the creak of a wagon wheel and the heavy tread of boots across the dusty main street of Dry Creek. She and Clara were at the mercantile that day, gathering flour and soap, when the sound of horseshoes striking against hard-packed dirt made her blood run cold. She didn't have to look up to know. Some instincts were too deeply carved by fear to be mistaken. The bell above the mercantile door jingled, and a man stepped inside. His voice carried first, low, rough, tinged with authority that had once caged her life. "Well now, didn't think I'd find you all the way out here." Her hands froze around the sack of flour. She dared to lift her eyes, and the sight of him stole her breath. It was as though the past itself had walked in, broad-shouldered, familiar, cruel. His clothes were finer than most men in town wore, but travel dust clung to them, and his smile was thin as a blade. Clara, sensing the shift, edged closer to her. "Do you know him?" she whispered. The young woman couldn't answer. Her throat had closed tight, her body trembling. She had run for so long, always fearing this moment, and now here it was. The man, her pursuer, her tormentor, the shadow she had tried to leave behind, stepped closer, ignoring the other customers who had begun to glance nervously between them. "You've caused me no end of trouble, girl," he said smoothly. "But it's finished now. You're coming back with me." Her pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to speak, to deny him, to scream, but fear rooted her to the spot. Only Clara's small hand clutching hers gave her the strength to take a step back. Before the man could reach her, another presence filled the doorway. Daniel Hayes. He had come to fetch feed, but one look at the scene told him enough. He read the fear in the woman's eyes, the predatory gleam in the man's, the way Clara clung protectively to the stranger. Without a word, Daniel crossed the floor and placed himself between them. "Something wrong here?" Daniel's voice was calm, but steel edged every syllable. The man sneered. "This is no concern of yours, Hayes. She belongs to me." Belongs. The word sliced through the young woman like a whip. Memories flooded back, nights of cold commands, the sharp sting of betrayal, the constant reminder that in his eyes she had been nothing more than property. Daniel's jaw tightened. He shifted slightly, enough to shield her and Clara behind him. "No one belongs to you," he said evenly. "She's under my roof now. That makes it my concern." The man's sneer widened into a smirk. "You think you can keep her?" "I have papers, boy. Promises made, debts owed. She's mine by right." The woman shook her head desperately, words finally spilling free. "No, I never. He lies. He—" Her voice cracked, but the truth was raw in her tone. Daniel didn't look back at her. His gaze never left the intruder. "Papers or no, she's not leaving with you today." The tension in the mercantile thickened until it seemed the air itself might snap. Customers edged toward the walls, whispering. The shopkeeper cleared his throat nervously, but said nothing. The man's smile faltered when Daniel didn't yield. He wasn't used to opposition, least of all from a man with such steady eyes. He spat on the floor, muttered a curse, and turned on his heel. "This isn't finished." The door slammed behind him, the bell jangling wildly. For a moment, silence hung heavy. The young woman stood trembling, her satchel clutched against her chest, her secret torn halfway into the light. She had wanted to keep it hidden, but now Daniel and half the town knew she was being hunted. Clara slipped her hand into hers again. "Don't worry," the girl whispered fiercely. "Papa won't let him take you." Daniel turned then, his gaze softening when it met hers. "You don't have to tell me everything now," he said quietly. "But know this. You're safe here. I'll see to that." The woman's knees nearly buckled. For so long she had carried her fear alone, believing no one would stand with her. And now, in the midst of her past clawing its way back, someone had stood like a wall between her and the storm. But deep inside, she knew the fight wasn't over. The past had found her, and it would not let go so easily. That night, the ranch house felt different. The familiar creaks of the wood, the soft hiss of the lantern, even Clara's sleepy breathing down the hall, all of it seemed sharper, heavier, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of what had happened in town. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a cup of untouched tea. Her hands trembled, not from the chill but from the memory of the man's voice echoing in her ears. You belong to me. She had run so far, endured so much, and still he had found her. Daniel entered quietly, his broad shoulders framed in the doorway. He had finished tending the animals hours ago, but his boots and shirt were still dusted from the barn, as if he had needed the steadying rhythm of work before facing what waited here. You haven't touched your tea, he said, his voice gentle. She forced a smile that felt brittle. I wasn't thirsty. He crossed the room and sat opposite her. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the lamp. His gaze was steady, not demanding, not prying, but waiting. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You must think me a fool, bringing trouble to your door, to Clara. Daniel shook his head. Trouble has a way of finding folks who don't deserve it. That doesn't make it their fault. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. She had carried her story for so long, burying it beneath silence because no one had wanted to hear, no one had cared. But here, with his calm patience, she felt the fragile urge to finally lay it down. He wasn't lying, she said softly, staring into her tea. Not about having papers. My father, he owed a debt, and to settle it, he promised me. Promised. Me like I was livestock. I was 17 when he came to collect. Her voice faltered. She drew a shaky breath. I couldn't bear it, so I ran. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I've been running ever since. Every town I stop in, whispers start. People want to know who I am, where I came from, and when I can't answer, when I don't dare, they look at me like I'm something shameful. Her throat closed as the tears finally slipped free. I didn't want Clara to look at me that way. I didn't want you to regret letting me stay. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. She braced herself for the sound she had always heard after such confessions, condemnation, dismissal, the cold edge of rejection. But Daniel only leaned forward, his eyes steady. You were a girl, cornered, traded, betrayed by the ones meant to protect you. That's not shame, and it's sure not sin. That's survival. Her breath hitched. No one had ever said it so plainly. Daniel's voice softened. If you want to keep running, I won't stop you. But if you stay, know this, no. One takes you from here against your will, not while I'm breathing. The words struck deeper than she could have imagined. A promise, not of ownership, but of protection. Not chains, but a choice. From down the hall, Clara's sleepy voice drifted, fragile and sweet. Papa, are you still up? Daniel glanced toward the sound, then back to her. His eyes said what his lips did not. You are part of this home already, whether you believe it or not. The young woman pressed the locket in her palm, the metal warm from her touch. She had clung to it for so long as proof of who she had been, of what she had lost. But sitting here now, she realized it was not her past that defined her. It was this moment, this choice. Slowly, she nodded. I don't want to run anymore. Daniel's shoulders eased, and for the first time since she had met him, a faint smile touched his lips. Then you don't have to. Later, when she tucked Clara back beneath her quilt, the little girl sleepily reached for her hand. You'll be here when I wake? Her throat tightened, but her answer came clear and firm. Yes, Clara. I'll be here. As she smoothed the blanket, she felt a shift deep within. A decision made, a burden lifted. She had chosen not just safety, but belonging. And though danger still loomed on the horizon, for the first time in years, hope glowed brighter than fear. The days that followed her decision were both the hardest and the sweetest she had ever known. Hard, because the shadow of her past still lingered just beyond the horizon, threatening to sweep back at any moment. Sweet, because for the first time in years, she was not facing it alone. Each morning, she woke to the steady sounds of life on the ranch. Clara's chatter in the kitchen, Daniel's boots on the porch, the hens clucking for feed. Ordinary sounds, but to her they were extraordinary, proof that she was part of something solid and real. Each evening, she sat at the table and passed biscuits, or mended Clara's dresses by lantern light, or listened to Daniel's quiet voice telling stories of cattle drives and storms weathered long before she came. These small moments became her anchor. Yet, beneath it all, tension simmered. The man who claimed her as his still lurked somewhere beyond Dry Creek. She could feel him in every unexpected sound, every stranger's glance. The town, too, remained divided. Some offered her kindness, moved by the way Clara clung to her and the steadiness with which Daniel defended her place at the ranch. Others whispered sharper rumors, tongues wagging that Daniel had taken in a woman with a scandalous past. The breaking point came one Sunday morning. Daniel, Clara, and the young woman rode into town for church. She had hesitated at the door, fear twisting her stomach, but Clara had squeezed her hand and whispered, "You belong with us." So she went. The church was small, its wooden pews filled with neighbors whose eyes lingered too long as she slipped inside beside Daniel and Clara. The whispers buzzed like hornets. She tried to focus on the hymn, on Clara's clear, sweet voice, but every note trembled with her dread, and then, during the sermon, the door opened. He was there, the man from her past. Dust clung to his coat, but his arrogance was polished sharp as ever. He stepped into the aisle with the confidence of a man who believed the world, and everyone in it, owed him obedience. His eyes found her instantly. The preacher faltered mid-sentence. The congregation stiffened, breath holding like the pause. "Before a storm breaks." "There she is," the man drawled, his voice cutting through the hush. "My runaway. You all ought to know she's mine by right." Gasps rippled through the room. She felt Clara press against her side, small fingers, digging into her arm. Before fear could paralyze her, Daniel rose, slowly, deliberately. He placed himself between her and the man, his broad frame shielding her as he had before. His voice carried, calm but unyielding. "You're mistaken," Daniel said. "She's no one's property. Not now, not ever." The man scoffed. "You think you can stand against me, Hayes? I've got law and papers on my side." "Papers don't make chains," Daniel replied. His gaze never wavered. "And law or no, I won't let you drag her back." The room was silent save for the pounding of her heart. She felt her legs shake, her throat tighten. All her life she had been told she was weak, voiceless. But now, with Clara's hand clutching hers and Daniel's strength braced before her, something within her stirred, something stronger than fear. She rose. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. Every eye turned to her, but she no longer flinched from their weight. She looked straight at the man who had haunted her life. "I don't belong to you. I never did. My father's promises were not mine to give. I will not go with you. I choose my own life. I choose my family." Clara squeezed her hand, her little face fierce with pride. Daniel's shoulders eased, just slightly, but his stance remained solid. The man's face darkened, his arrogance faltering under the weight of her defiance. He cursed under his breath, glared at Daniel, then at the watching congregation. For once, the town's silence was not complicit. It was judgment. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost his grip. With a final sneer, he turned and stalked out, the church door slamming behind him. The preacher cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to resume the sermon, but the moment had already reshaped everything. The whispers of the town shifted that day, from suspicion to respect, from doubt to recognition. For the first time, she was not a stranger under Daniel's roof, but a woman who had stood, claimed her voice, and chosen her place. When they returned to the ranch that evening, the prairie stretched wide and golden before them. Clara rode between them, humming a hymn under her breath. Daniel glanced at her once, his eyes soft but unreadable, and tipped, his hat against the setting sun. The young woman looked out across the horizon. For years it had been the edge of her fear, the endless road of running. But now, it was something else entirely. A new dawn, a beginning. She wasn't running anymore. She was home.